and gentlemen, thanks very much. I'm giving a talk today on long-range shooting and 5 shooting principles of long-range shooting that's going to help you become a better shooter, extend the distance of your shooting from what you can currently do. So my name is Zaine Beaton. I am the manager of Beaton Firearms and also the director of a company named Precision Shooting, which we train people to shoot long range. So I am reading off notes on the lectern because I do want to make sure that I cover everything in here. So I can give you the best rounded sort of education on these terms. So shooting long range is achievable, and it's achievable by just about any shooter with just a little bit of knowledge of how projectiles work in the air. I get asked a lot, what do you need to consider when shooting long range? Do I need to account for temperature? Do I need to account for wind? And my answer is always the same. It depends. It depends on what caliber firearm you've got. It depends on the size of the target. It can depend on a lot of different things. How big is your target? If your target is rather wide, then it's not as, your shot isn't going to be as sensitive to wind as a shot that's on a target that's very narrow. Nearly all shooters can hit a target 100 millimeters in size from about 250 metres away. So it's with very minimal training at all. So 2 years ago at the SHOT Show in 2016, I gave a presentation on the 5 marksmanship principles for accurate shooting. And they were stance, grip, sights, trigger and follow through. So if you want some more information on that, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it's on our website, on the blog section of our website. So a complete novice can master these principles in only a few hours and can learn to shoot a rifle with precision, which is a small group size. Of course, this also depends on the ability of the rifle and the ammunition, which is what my previous 2 talks were about, reloading ammunition and building a rifle to perform how you want it to. But hitting a target at a distance of 250 metres requires no knowledge of external ballistics. It's not much harder than hitting a target at 80 metres. But once you start shooting beyond 250 metres is when some factors can come into play. I'm going to give you 5 points that you can learn to accurately shoot beyond that 250 metre bracket. So, the first point. So the five points that I'm going to cover are distance, scope adjustments, external ballistics, standard deviation and wind. So the first point is distance. So when I say distance, many people think that I assume that I mean the distance to the target. And you're partially correct, but what I also mean is what distance is your rifle sighted in for? If you're trying to hit a target at say 350 metres, then you're going to have to wind your elevation dial up or hold over the top of the target to hit it. And people who own 7mm rem mags or 25-06 rifles are going to hate this, but no caliber will shoot flat to 350 metres. They just don't. Every single caliber will have a measure of drop at that distance. And if you want the highest possibility of hitting a target at that distance, you need to center your group over the target. So to hit a target, you will have to wind the elevation up, but how much? That depends on a lot of things, and it depends on where your rifle is sighted in at the first place. If you're sighted in at 100 metres, then you're going to have to wind your scope up a bit. But if you're already sighted in at 300 or 350 metres, you don't have to wind your elevation up at all. So let's say you're shooting somewhere about 250 metres with a 308. Now normally, if you've got 100 metre zero, you're going to have to wind your elevation dial up around about 2.6 mils. Your zero is now 350 metres, not 100 metres. And if you didn't know that you'd wound that up, or you'd forgotten that you'd wound it up, the next time you shoot at 350 metres, you might think you have to wind your scope up another 2.6 mils. And you're going to shoot about a metre over top of the target. So it's important to know at all times what your rifle is zeroed in at. So, because your zero's distance can change, it's why a zero stop on your rifle scope is very important. If you've got an elevation dial with zero stop, you're always going to know where you are in the dial. Even in the dark, you can wind the scope back till you hit the zero stop and you know you're at your original zero, which is usually 100 metres. The other part of distance is the distance to the target, and most shooters claim to be good at estimating distance to the target. But when you put someone to the test, someone who is good at estimating distance can rarely estimate distance more accurately than 50 metres either side of the target at long range. Is that target 300 metres away, or 350 metres away, or 400 metres away? It can be very hard to tell with your eyes exactly how far away that is. So hitting a 100 millimetre target at that distance when estimating with your eyes is more luck than skill. A more accurate way of measuring distance is using a ranging reticle. Leupold introduced a ranging reticle on their VX3 model scopes years ago, which were really good for shooting deer, and you would bracket a target around about 1 metre high with the duplex reticle and then read off the distance from that. Mildot and TMR style reticles are also really good at estimating range, but they all depend on you knowing the size of the target. If you know the approximate height of the target, getting to a distance to within about 10 metres either side of the target is very achievable with a ranging reticle. And that's a hit on a 100 mil target at 350 metres every time. If you get your distance error to within 10 metres of the target, you'll hit it every time with a 308 distance. But obviously if you're shooting a smaller target than 100 mil, or if you're shooting a target at a longer distance, a more accurate distance measurements will be required, which is where laser rangefinders come into play. Not only are they very accurate, they're also extremely quick to use, and so you can eliminate the error due to distance very, very easily, because pretty much any laser rangefinder will give you an accurate distance measurement to within 1 yard. So if you know the distance that your gun is sighted in at, and you know the distance to the target, you're well on your way to hitting targets at 350 metres. The next point is scope adjustments. So knowing how much one click on your scope adjusts the point of impact is quite easy, yeah? The scope manufacturer told you this when you bought the scope, or it's written on the outside of the box. Some scope manufacturers even engrave it on the scope turrets so you can tell. But do you really know what those adjustments mean, and do you know that your scope adjusts accurately? There are 3 main scales of adjustment. There's what they call shooter MOA, there's true MOA, and then there's mil radian. So shooter MOA is 1/4 inch at 100 yards. True MOA is 1/4 minute of angle at 100 yards, so which is 1/3600th of a circle. And mil radian adjustment is 1/10 of 1,000th of a radian. So I'm not going to go into the technical details of exactly what they mean, but basically this is what they're supposed to be at 100 metres, which I'm using as a common distance. Now, did I have this? No, I didn't. So shooter MOA is 6.95 millimetres at 100 metres. True MOA is 7.27 millimetres at 100 metres, and mil radian is 10 millimetres at 100 metres. Now, a lot of people will get shooter MOA and true MOA mixed up. They'll think they've got a scope with true MOA when they've actually got shooter MOA, or vice versa. And that matters very little at 100 metres, but it matters a lot when you're trying to hit a target at 450, 500 metres, which is sort of the next goal. So a close approximation for MOA is 1 inch at 100 yards, but even this isn't exactly correct. So if we're using an approximated measurement for MOA and an approximated distance, which we covered in the last point, you'll have a compounded error. So if you're shooting targets at 450 metres now, and you need to come up 16 inches to hit the target, a lot of people would think that would have to come up 16 MOA, but they wouldn't. You'd only have to come up 14 MOA. So knowing what your adjustments are and what they mean is very important for long range shooting. Now, if you just drop $4.5 grand on a flash new scope that says 1 click is 0.1 mil radian, how do you know that your adjustments are exact? And we've encountered this a lot. It hardly matters at 100 metres, but if your adjustments are out only by if your adjustments are out by 5%, that's only 0.5 millimetre of error at 100 metres. But if you're shooting long range, that error compounds and becomes very, very large when you have to come up sort of 16, 20 MOA, and then all of a sudden you're having to come up an extra MOA because your scope doesn't adjust what it says it does, you're going to fall short. And you might think this is unlikely or it doesn't matter and you can just crank it up. But it's not just the error that's important, it's attributing the error to the right variable. If you adjust up for a certain distance and the bullets strike low, a lot of shooters will attribute this to ballistic coefficient or velocity being lower than what they thought it was. So you shoot at a target at long range, you drop short, how do you know which one to attack? Now if you can adjust this by changing the velocity, say, if your bullets are falling short, you drop your velocity down because you think your velocity is not as high as what it was, and it brings your shot up. But then if you shoot at something further away, you might start going over the top because your velocity is what it says it is, your scope's just not adjusting enough. So calibrating the scope, we need to know exactly what one click of adjustment is on our point of aim, and it's vital for hitting targets at 450 metres or more. And we do this with the tall target test. So at 100 metres, you put a metre high target up, you shoot right at the bottom of the target and shoot a group. You then come up 10 mil radian, which should be a metre, or you come up 40 MOA, and measure the distance between your two groups and make sure that your scope is adjusting what it says it should adjust. Okay, the next point that I'm going to touch on is external ballistics. External ballistics covers what happens to the projectile between leaving the barrel and hitting the target. And having even a basic understanding of what external ballistics is will help you hit targets at 500 metres and further. Trajectory, which is a more common term, is part of external ballistics, and it describes the arc of the projectile between the barrel and the target. But this is generally a simple two-dimensional description, and external ballistics is much more complicated, much nerdier than a two-dimensional description. You don't need to understand the physics of external ballistics, only the individual components of external ballistics and how they affect bullet flight. The main two factors that we're going to cover in ballistic coefficient of the projectile and the velocity that the projectile is fired at. So, ballistic coefficient is a comparison of your projectile to a standard projectile. There are a few different standards for using ballistic coefficients, and you've probably heard of G1 ballistic coefficient or G7 ballistic coefficient, which is the most common too. So a G1 ballistic coefficient is a comparison of your projectile to the G1 standard projectile. It's the oldest projectile standard that we know. And it's actually a comparison to a 1-inch artillery shell. So they're comparing your small rifle caliber to a 1-inch artillery shell, and that changes during flight. So you might have a G1 ballistic coefficient of the muzzle of 0.5, but by the time you get to 400 or 500 metres, it's dropped to 0.4, 0.3, 0.2. It changes during flight. A G7 comparison is a comparison to the G7 model, which is a more accurate model for small arms. You'll have the same ballistic coefficient through the whole flight. So I recommend if you're using a projectile that's got a bow tail with a long nose with a high ballistic coefficient, use a G7 ballistic coefficient, you'll get a much more accurate result. So when you've got your ballistic coefficient, how does that affect your flight? Well, the ballistic coefficient is a comparison to the ideal one of how efficient it is through the air. So if you've got two projectiles that are fired at the same speed and they've got different BCs, so say one's got a G1 BC of 0.5 and the other one's got a G1 BC of 0.55, the one with the higher BC will reach the target first, it will have drifted less from wind, it will hit the target with a higher velocity and energy, and it would have dropped less in trajectory. The projectile with the higher BC will also reach the transonic zone, which is the point at which the projectile starts to come back through the sound barrier, further away from the barrel, meaning it will have a potential for accuracy for longer distance. So having a high BC is very important. But that's not to say that as you go higher in BC, generally the bullets get heavier and the bullets go slower, so you need to get a good trade-off. And the next point that I'm going to touch on is velocity. This is how fast the projectile is travelling, and it's always dropping for small arm projectiles between the barrel and the target. Using information such as ballistic coefficient and atmospheric conditions, there's a very smart software available that calculates the velocity at different points during flight. What we are mainly interested in is the muzzle velocity. This couples with BC to give a very close estimate to the flight of the projectile. And when I say muzzle velocity, it's very important that I stress it's the muzzle velocity that's important. If you're using a chronograph that uses visible light, you're going to have to position that about 15 feet in front of the barrel so the flash from the muzzle doesn't set it off or disturb the reading that you get. And if you're measuring velocity 15 feet from the front of the barrel, that's not muzzle velocity. You have to account for that. Yeah? Your velocity will be slightly higher at the muzzle. So chronographs such as the magnetospeed chronograph, which measures true muzzle velocity, so it provides very accurate data for estimating trajectory. The ballistic coefficient is trickier to estimate. Depending on your projectile choice and your personal preference, you may choose a G1 BC, so if you're shooting a flat-based projectile, or a G7 BC if you're shooting a boat-tailed high BC projectile. So it's hard to recommend where to get the best data from, but generally speaking, it's always best to start with the bullet manufacturer's data. And that may change slightly for your gun, because your gun fires at different velocities. So a G1 BC would generally vary from the gun to gun, whereas a G7 BC will stay the same regardless of what velocity you fire it at. So if you accurately estimate the muzzle velocity and the ballistic coefficient of the projectile in conjunction with the previous points that I've mentioned, it'll go a long way to accurately estimating the flight of your projectile and striking targets at 500 metres or further. The fourth point that I'm going to touch on today is standard deviation. So standard deviation is how much the velocity of each round differs from your average velocity. So if you've got a big standard deviation, it means that each bullet that's high varies in velocity a lot. If you've got a small standard deviation, it means that they're all fired within a very small band. So if your velocity is 3,000 feet per second and the standard deviation is 20, then 95 out of 100 projectiles fired will travel between 20 feet per second either side of your average, either side of 3,000 feet per second. So, variations in velocity of projectiles can be affected by many things. Difference in brass wall thickness, difference in powder primer burn rate, powder volumes, neck wall thickness, and many other things. But some of the things that you can do to mitigate these variables is buy good quality brass, where the thickness and the strength of the brass is consistent. Good quality primers that are good for the volume of powder that you're using. If you're using more than about 65 grains of powder, you need to be using a Magnum primer, or you'll get a big standard deviation. The burn rate will change. Use a good powder for the burn rate for the cartridge and projectile selection. You want to be filling the case up to about 90% of its maximum capacity to get a low standard deviation. Buy a good powder thrower or set of powder scales. Turn the necks of your brass to ensure that they're all the same thickness, or that they're all concentric, because a lot of brass is not concentric. You can anneal the necks of your cases for uniform elasticity. Buy good quality seating dies to get your seating depth exactly the same, and make sure you run your barrels in correctly. If you run your barrel incorrectly, you'll eliminate all of the little machining marks inside the barrel, and then keeps your velocity more consistent. So as you can see, most of the things you can do to get the standard deviation depth down is actually done in the reloading room. Load good quality ammo and you'll get the deviation down. Now deviation is very important for long range accuracy, because if you've got a higher standard deviation, your fast velocity shots will go high and your low velocity shots will go low. And you'll have what they call vertical stringing, which is the diagram on the right. So your shots will go up and down the target. If you get your standard deviation and your velocity down, and we ideally want it at least 10 or less, then you're going to have a much tighter group. You're not going to have as many shots up and down the target. The last point that I'm going to talk about is wind, and wind is perhaps the most difficult part of long range shooting. It's extremely difficult to teach someone about wind, It's very hard to estimate, and even the latest gadgets and tools only tell you what the wind is doing where you are. It doesn't tell you what the wind is doing downrange. The best way to learn about wind is to spend a lot of time behind the butt of the rifle and shoot a lot of rounds. But what I'm going to try and do today is I'm going to talk about wind in a couple of different factors to try and break it down for you so you know what you need to concentrate on when you're out in the field. And those two parts are strength and direction. I've got another slide. Yeah. So strength and direction are the two main parts of wind. Both are very easy to work out, but strength is the more important one because it's the harder of the two to work out, and it has a more dramatic effect on the projectile and where it lands. Wind coming from 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock will have full sideways value on the effect of, we call it the value, on the sideways effect on the projectile. However, the wind direction changes more as it changes to 12 o'clock or 6 o'clock. The wind has less and less effect on the sideways position of the projectile. A lot of people think that a 45-degree angle, wind coming at 45, will have half value. It doesn't, it has 0.7 value. Wind coming from 1 o'clock has half value, and wind coming from 2 o'clock has 0.8 value. Yeah. When the wind is coming if you have wind coming from 1 o'clock, it would only affect the projectile half that of the wind coming from 3 o'clock. And that would be the same as coming from 11 o'clock. So any increase or decrease in the strength of the wind, so say you had a 10 kilometre hour wind and it changed by 3 kilometres an hour, that would only have an effect on the projectile of 1.5 kilometres an hour. So it would only have a small effect on the projectile. But if the wind was to change, say from 1 o'clock to 11 o'clock, you've had a full value of wind change. So instead of putting a half value onto the left, you have to put a half value onto the right. So that's a full value change. So if you've got a headwind, it's very important for you to watch the direction that the wind is coming from more than the strength. A change in strength won't change it much. A change in direction will change the wind value dramatically. But when the wind is coming from the side, it's the opposite. A wind from, say, 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock would have exactly the same wind value because it affects the projectile exactly the same. But if you have an increase of, say, a 10 kilometre hour wind from 3 o'clock and it increased up to 13 kilometres an hour, that's a significant change in the wind value that you have to put on the projectile. So when the wind is coming from the side, it's much more important to watch the strength of the wind rather than the direction. Small changes in direction will have no impact on the bullet point of impact, but a strength change will. So if you use these 2 points, it means you can concentrate on the important parts of wind and develop your own skill in calling the wind. And wind doesn't blow the projectile sideways through the air, it doesn't move sideways. Wind actually changes the direction of the projectile. So if you have a wind coming from left to right where you're shooting from, it'll permanently change the direction of that projectile. Okay? So obviously if you have a small change in the direction of the projectile at the shooter, it'll have a dramatic effect at long range. If you have an effect on the projectile due to wind at long range, it will only have a fraction of the change to the projectile point of impact. So the wind at the shooter is much more important. Okay. It's not to say that you shouldn't be watching the wind at long range as well. And one of the best methods of watching wind at long range is mirage. If you look through the scope and you've got a nice boiling wind coming straight up at the targets, you know there's a mirage coming up at the targets, you know there's very little wind. But if you've got a wind that's boiling up at about 45 degrees angle, you know you're going to have around about 10 kilometres an hour of wind. Yeah? Wind that cuts across the ground quite quickly is around about 20 kilometres an hour. Yeah? So by watching that wind, you can tell what the wind's doing. And the wind may be very different from where you're shooting from where the targets are, especially if you're shooting over a ridge, over a creek or something like that. So, wind doesn't blow the projectile. So to surmise, if you consider these 5 points, you'll be well on your way to extending your shooting further and further. So I'll go over them again. So distance. It's important to judge your distance accurately. Scope adjustments. Know what your scope adjustments are and test your scope. Even expensive scopes can have faults. External ballistics, ballistic coefficient and velocity, make sure you know what they are. Standard deviation, you need to get your standard deviation and your velocity as small as possible. And wind. Wind is all about practice. So long range shooting can be challenging, but it's also a lot of fun. It's easy and inexpensive to get into, and anyone can do it with minimal changes to their rifle or ammo selection, providing a challenge, and provides a challenge to even the most seasoned shooter. So most people who've got high-powered rifles can take the rifle that they're shooting now out and do long-range shooting. You might not think you can, but most rifles will be able to shoot pretty much any rifle, even a basic off-the-shelf 223, you'll be able to hit a 100mm target at about 450 metres with very little changes to the current setup. It's not expensive sport to get into. There's never been as much interest in recreational long-range shooting as there has been right now in Western Australia. And this presentation has been a lot of fun, but there's some very serious issues that are putting this emerging sport under threat. Firearms licensing services are enforcing undocumented policy, placing arbitrary calibre restrictions, and even threatening the seizure of long-range firearms from shooters. In fact, they just seized about 11 50 BMG rifles from law-abiding shooters. Never has so much power been exerted in Western Australian police over law-abiding firearm owners. I'm not sure where the prejudice is coming from, but I do know that it is absolutely scandalous that our police minister, previous police minister and police commissioner have all allowed firearms licensing services to go beyond their charge and enforce their own version of the laws, like vigilantes of the Wild West. Unless West Australian shooters band together, this side of the sport will be taken from us the way they were taken from us in '97 and again in 2001 with the handgun buyback, and again in 2017 with the Adlers, and again in 2018 with the 50 BMG target rifles. And what's going to come next? If you want to see the sport of shooting continue to flourish, I would recommend getting involved in some long-range shooting. The more people that are involved in long-range shooting, the more of a voice we have, especially in the political circles. So you'll be doing the sport a real favour, and you'll probably even be enjoying yourself while you're doing it. Thanks very much for your time this evening, guys.